Welcome all to this plenary session, Is Canadian Democracy Under Threat? I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that our meeting location is on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanawagwaga Mohawk Nation, which is known as the gathering place for many First Nations, and we recognize them as custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. I'd like to set the table for this plenary session. And maybe the first thing I should do is introduce myself. I'm a journalist. My name is Jonathan Montpetit. Somebody let a journalist in. I'm sorry, but you have to deal with it. I work for the CBC News, where I cover Quebec politics, currently covering the Quebec election. And I'm also an investigative reporter where my beat includes far-right populist movements in Canada. So getting back to the task at hand of setting the table for this session, here's some of the themes that we'd like to consider. So on the one hand, the question of whether Canadian democracy is under threat is, in comparative terms, largely settled. Canada is considered a full and robust democracy by any measure, with resilient democratic institutions, a pluralistic political culture, a vibrant civil society, and a constitutionalized protection for minority rights. On the other hand, numerous social, political, and economic forces, both new and old, can have a potentially corrosive effect on even the most stable of democratic societies. In Canada, long-standing issues such as the increasingly contentious dynamics of federalism, the divisiveness of Quebec nationalism, stalled reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the urban-rural divide, gaping holes in the social safety net, the housing crisis in urban centers, the looming climate disaster, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and unresponsive democratic institutions all remain unresolved. Moreover, recent social movements that seek to challenge the very meaning and motives of Canadian democratic rule, including Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, land defenders, and the so-called Freedom Convoy, have suggested that formal venues of political power are inaccessible for large portions of the population. So the question is, can Canadian democracy respond to the new, old, and recalcitrant forces of the 21st century? If so, how? And if not, at what cost? Allow me now to introduce our panel, our very distinguished panel, I might add. My far left is Yann Allard-Tremblay, an assistant professor in the political science department at McGill University. Beland, director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and a James McGill professor in the political science department at McGill. Debra Thompson holds a Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Studies at McGill University, where she's an associate professor in the political science department. Antje Ellermann is professor of political science at the University of British Columbia and founding director of UBC's Center for Migration Studies. And Sheryl Lightfoot holds a Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics at the University of British Columbia, where she is also an associate professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies and in the Department of Political Science. As you can see, we've divided the McGill professors and the UBC professors away. Hopefully, they don't fight. So let's begin. The question I want to begin with, and Professor Ellermann will be called upon to get us going, is basically, what are some of the most important threats facing democracy in Canada today?
All right, I'll start with one.
Yeah, an easy one to begin.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So I want to make a pitch for taking seriously the threat of right-wing populism in Canada. And Jonathan, I didn't know that was one of your areas of investigative reporting, so I hope you will chime in there and correct me where necessary. I think those of us, at least in Canada, but even abroad, we've thought about these issues this year in particular, starting this January with the so-called Freedom Convoy, when Ottawa was in chaos for 4 weeks as truckers and supporters moved into the city and started out as a response against Trudeau upholding the vaccine mandate for truckers coming into Canada, but then it became a much larger protest against all health or pandemic restrictions and against the Prime Minister himself. So that was kind of a first event, I think, that shook the nation, I think that's fair to say, put it that way. The second happened just last week when Pierre Poilievre became the leader of the Conservative Party on the first ballot, so with strong support. And those of us following this know that he ran on a rather populist agenda for Canadian standards. And so the question is Canada, which at this point still kind of counts as this exceptional case compared to the US and Europe in terms of far-right populism, is Canada now on a path that follows these other countries? I think that's a really important question. And I want to I know we have more time to talk about that later, but I want to just briefly say two things to that question. The first one is that I do believe that Canada is facing a right-wing populist moment at the moment. But I also think that this looks different from the kind of populism that we've been following in Europe and even in the United States, because the socially conservative or culturally conservative hot button issues, in particular immigration, but also reproductive rights, sexual and gender minority rights, are not the focus of the attack here. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind as we try to assess what is happening in Canada. And the second point is that it still matters to think about that, because I think one of the biggest challenges that the way that populism operates right now here is that it really seeks to undermine trust in political institutions, in important social institutions. And it does so in a way that dismantles and undermines without providing a basis for building something constructive. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Lightfoot, would you like to go ahead?
Many thanks, Antje, for your intro, and many thanks for the land acknowledgement as well. It's a wonderful way to start. And I'd like to begin there as well. I recognize that we are meeting on Mohawk territory, and there are a couple important communities very close by that give us some background as to the history and the current state of democracy as seen through the eyes of some of the Indigenous peoples who have lived in these lands for thousands of years. So Ganawage is just over the river, and that has been a site of fierce resistance to the Canadian state and the imposition of Canadian democracy by way of the Indian Act and banned council governments for many, 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 many years. And also close by is the community of Ganazadage, which, if we remember our not too distant history, although this is getting more and more in the rearview mirror now, the Oka crisis and a military intervention in the Ganazadage Oka just in the 1990s, so not really that long ago. So that's what democracy and Canadian democracy looks like from the perspective of Indigenous peoples who are resistant to the idea that democracy should be in an individualistic conception. They prefer to participate many times as nations, as governments, whether they're treated or untreated, and we have a variety of arrangements across this vast land. Some are willing to participate as individuals in the democratic society, others are not. And then there's a range in between. But at the moment, we only really have place for those who wish to participate as individuals or as interest groups. And we are just at the cusp as a society of figuring out how to make accommodations in our democracy for participation in nation-to-nation style relationships in this country. So I think if you look at the current moment of democracy in Canada from an Indigenous lens, it's flipped. There is no golden age in the background. The background for Indigenous people is often a history of violence and oppressive, repressive democracy. So what we can say is, even with all of the challenges that we are going to hear about today, the Indigenous perspective flips that on its end. The history has not been very good at all, and I think I mentioned the word democratic deficit while we were preparing, and one of my panelists chuckled and said, well, that's a polite way to put it. But we could start with democratic deficit for Indigenous peoples and move all the way up to violent interventions has been the democratic experience, and everything in the middle. And so I actually have been seeing some hopeful signs about accommodation for Indigenous participation on the horizon. So I'm going to play devil's advocate on this panel and flip things around.
Thank you so much, Professor Lightfoot. Professor Thompson.
So the most important threats to Canadian democracy, to me, it depends on how you think about democracy. And so I think that we most often in political science think about democracy in terms of the formal institutions of government and voting and elections, and those things that actually don't happen all that often, or they happen regularly in a democracy, but they don't happen frequently. And I'm more interested in thinking about how people actually experience democracy. And I'm following here the work of Vesla Weaver and Joe Sauce and thinking about what they call the second face of the state, right? So the ways in which there are activities of governing officials and institutions which exert social control and encompass modes of governance that are based on surveillance, coercion, punitive regulation, predation, discipline, violence, right? And so here I'm most obviously thinking about the way in which for a lot of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized minorities in this country, our interactions with the state are violent. Our interactions with the state are coercive, they're punitive. And most obviously we can think about policing, right? And the entire apparatus of the criminal punishment system. We know that if you're low income, if you're a person of color, if you're homeless, if you have mental illness, you're much more likely to be stopped, carded, charged, arrested, or possibly killed by the police. But I also want to think here about those aspects of state power that we don't often think of as being coercive or punitive, but which our experiences as racialized minorities, we frequently experience them as coercive. So here we can think of the K-12 education system, right? And the ways in which Black children are being put in handcuffs, right? And suspended and expelled at disproportionate rates. We can think of the healthcare system and the ways in which it's not only failing many racialized minorities, but the way in which healthcare itself is frequently experienced as coercive. We can think about child protective services and the foster care system, thinking of the work of Cindy Blackstock here. Welfare offices, landlord-tenant tribunals, border agents, refugee board hearings, and the labyrinth of immigration bureaucracy, not to mention Indigenous Services Canada. And so for me, if we're thinking about democracy, let's think about the democratic experience that we have actually interacting with the state and the ways in which this liberal democratic face of voting and elections and free and fair elections and representation tells a very, very narrow story of a very small part of the population, which in fact, many of our other experiences with the state are much more frequent, coercive, violent, and problematic.
Thank you. Professor Beland.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, I decided that we had some level of coordination, so I decided to talk about the most boring topic, which is formal political institutions. And of course, when we talk about potential institutional threats or issues within our parliamentary democracy, within our political system, a lot of Canadian political scientists have written about the concentration of power in the hands of the Prime Minister and the PMO. They have talked about the relative decline of the power of cabinet in that context. They have talked about what some see as the excessive strength of party discipline, even by parliamentary democracy standards, and also about the marginal role of backbenchers within the House of Commons, and also at the provincial level in the legislatures. But I decided to talk about something else. It might not be the most important threat to our democracy, but I think it's a problem. I will call it constitutional stagnation. I think that our political class was traumatized by the defeats or the rejections, the failures of Lake Meech Accord and later the Charlottetown Accord. And now it's such a political taboo in this country to talk about any form of constitutional reform in terms of dealing with countrywide issues. I do think that at some point we'll have to move beyond that trauma. We have to address constitutional reform. When we deal with the Senate, when we deal with regional grievances, with the status of Quebec within Canada, and also when dealing with reconciliation. So at some point, if we want to think about transformative institutional change at the constitutional level, we will need to draw lessons from the failures of both Meech and Charlottetown Accords, but also start to think that at some point there is some constitutional debate that we'll need to have instead of always saying, no, it's too controversial, it's too dangerous, blah, blah, blah. Another thing I want to mention in terms of institutional stagnation more generally is, of course, electoral reform. Electoral reform, which was promised by key party leaders, including Justin Trudeau before he became prime minister, and then he abandoned it. Same thing in Quebec with François Legault, who, of course, when he was in the opposition, you talk about electoral reform, and then when you form government, you forget about it. Oh, it's too controversial. Or, as François Legault said not long ago, the Premier of Quebec, he said, it's only for intellectuals. Only intellectuals care about electoral reform. Well, there are a lot of intellectuals in our society, it seems.
Professor Allard-Tremblay.
Thank you, merci. And Danielle, it wasn't as boring as you thought it was going to be. For me, I'm a political theorist working on questions of decolonization and indigenization. And so when I think of threats facing Canadian democracy today, I don't immediately think about exogenous threats. I'm more interested, and my focus turns more immediately to the limitations and the shortcomings of existing democratic practices and institutions and the ways in which we govern ourselves. And I do think that one of the big threats that Canadian democracy faces is, well, the assumption that we are fundamentally doing just fine, that there are threats, but that fundamentally the ways in which we govern ourselves and our institutions are good, they're fine, and we should carry on doing business as usual because these are exogenous threats. But I think that when we look at the climate crisis, the ways in which it has been created and it is being continuously recreated by our daily conduct, and the ways in which we have negotiated the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'll have time to explain later on in some other questions. And when we look at the ongoing conflicts over land between the state and Indigenous people, I do think that business as usual is not that great. I think that the ways in which we think about democracy in general and the ways in which we practice it generally express a form of logic of modernity coloniality, where Western settler ideas and practices are recognized and consolidated while Indigenous ones are destituted and sidelined and disqualified. Business as usual appears, well, natural. It has a sort of inertia. It carries on, but it also limits our ability to think and act otherwise, to imagine how change and transformation could be enacted when that's precisely what we need. I think that we need to decolonize and indigenize our democratic practices and the ways in which we think about democracy. Precisely, we need to become more responsive to one another, including to other than humans. We need to realize that our governance does not float free from the land, that it's always embedded in concrete ecological context that structure norms and practices. If we are to strive for the right relationship through democratic governance, achieve greater freedom and equality, I think that we do need to be able to think and act differently, to be able to challenge these dominating ideas. And we need to learn from the practices of governance of the first people of these lands.
Thank you, Thank you all. That gives us a lot to work with. I think I'm really excited for what you guys will have to say as we work through the questions. So the first question we decided to discuss runs like this. The pandemic saw the widespread use of emergency powers at the provincial level. For an extended period, the idea of protecting public health and safety was invoked to override individual rights. This likely helped save thousands of lives. But the benefits were not distributed equally, as some communities were exposed to greater risk than others. How do you think democracy in Canada has fared during the pandemic? And I'd like to, once again, call on Professor Allard-Tremblay to get us going on this question.
Thanks. But rather than thinking about how democracy fared during the pandemic, I want to say a few words about what our pandemic response discloses about our governmentality, about how we achieve compliance, but also what makes sense in our achievement of compliance and in the ways in which we seek to get people to do certain things like wear masks or stay at home, or what we ask them to expect through these measures. And I think that this helps us in part see some of the limitations of how we govern democratically today. Briefly, I see the governmentality that was expressed by the pandemic response as one of mastery. It's an ethos of governance where there's a fundamental separation and subordination between those who hold power and those who ought to obey, which focuses on the effectiveness of power to manage and control human conduct, but also the natural world. And that's important for some of the measures I'm going to be discussing. This form of governance relies on various technologies to achieve compliance, such as coercion and extreme surveillance like we had during the pandemic response. But importantly, it leads to a subjectification of ourselves as master and possessors of natures. For those who heard my talk earlier, I see you in the audience, something I discussed earlier as well. If we look at the pandemic response, I think that this mastery is very central to many of the measures that were put in place. Right? We put in place measures of stay-at-home orders, wearing masks, but always with a promise of returning to normal, always with a promise that control would be reasserted on the crisis and the crisis would be resolved and we could go back to normal without changing anything. Early on, we placed our hopes in the quick development of vaccines that would enable us, again, to carry business as usual. Obviously, as the months passed, this was increasingly a vanishing endpoint that kept being postponed, and that led to further tensions. And eventually, we were asked to learn to live with the virus. No matter what we did before, this is what we do now. Throughout the pandemic response, there were a few voices who raised the possibility that maybe we shouldn't return to normal. Maybe there was something wrong with normal. Maybe we shouldn't rush back to it. Maybe it's not worth returning back to it. But by and large, if you look today around ourselves, there's a few masks, a few added hand sanitizers, distributors, some remote work arrangement, but not much has changed in our societies. What I'm suggesting is that mastery prevents us from considering that maybe it is precisely the ways in which we conduct ourselves as master and possessors over natures and over one another that precipitated part of this crisis. Our invasion of ecosystems, our extractive industries that increasingly destroy biodiversity and that led to these increasing contact with zoonotic diseases. Mastery prevents us from being responsive to others and other than humans. We end up only focusing on the effectiveness of power and the capacities we have, and we end up disconnected. I think that changing our governance, changing and giving up on this ethos of mastery would make us more likely to accept change, not to seek to reassert control, but being able to assess the things that have to change in our conduct. And I think this is central to climate change. If we try to control and master climate change to return to normal, I don't think that's something that we will achieve. I think that requires profound transformations in how we conduct ourselves, govern ourselves, and live. And as long as we'll think that we are the masters of it, that's not going to happen.
I see you nodding away there, Professor Beland.
Yes, I agree with my colleague, of course, but I want to add something. I've been studying policy responses to COVID-19 in Canada and also in other parts of the world. And what is really striking about the politics of COVID-19 is how it stresses the tension between expertise and democracy, and the role of experts vis-a-vis elected officials. And we saw that, of course, in the US in almost a cartoonish way with the way Trump attacked and Dr. Fauci. But in Canada, we also saw these tensions at stake. For example, here in Quebec with Dr. Horacio Arruda, also the chief medical officer in the public health officer in the province, and the premier. And I think what's interesting we noticed during the pandemic is that politicians sometimes, when they adopt unpopular measures, they say that basically they had no choice. They followed what the experts said. But in fact, in the end, it's their decision. It's their call, right? It's their responsibility. And they have sometimes used these experts, these public officials, non-elected public officials, as basically shields to protect themselves against political blame. And I think that this is a crucial political issue, and it's something we should study more, the interaction between these experts who work for government and elected officials. And I think the pandemic, overall in Canada, I don't think the situation was as bad as what we saw in other countries like the US or Brazil. But I do think that we saw, I think, not only elected officials sometimes not listening to experts or pretending that they had no other choice because that's what the experts said. But in fact, we don't have full knowledge of what the different alternatives that the experts put on the table. But there is also another thing, which is the lack of any use of evidence to justify decisions that can have a very negative consequence on vulnerable people, like the second curfew in Quebec. So we had 2 curfews in Quebec during COVID-19, strict curfews. And when the Legault government announced the second curfew, journalists asked them, what evidence do you have that the first curfew actually had a positive impact in terms of the number of cases and so forth? The truth of the matter, they said, we don't have any evidence. In the end, they had to acknowledge that. So, of course, there's a debate in political science and policy research about evidence-based or at least evidence-informed policy. And you would think that during COVID-19, because experts played a major role, that evidence will be central to decision-making. But in some dramatic cases like this curfew, which is about a major limitation of our, individual freedoms and something that had a negative impact, especially on vulnerable people like homeless people, I think that this is something that we have to draw lessons from this moving forward to get ready for not just the next pandemic, but also to think more systematically about the role of experts and also evidence in our democracy.
Yeah, I'd like to get at the question of scientific expertise from a somewhat different angle, and maybe that's coming from British Columbia, where we had Bonnie Henry, which became an international celebrity initially in the pandemic, and where in the beginning, BC was held up as a sign of, scientific expertise as the legitimation and as guiding public policy in terms of the pandemic. But over time, that changed a lot, and the perception of Bonnie Henry changed a lot. And I want to just draw on 2 things. And I think that is one, how whenever we use expertise, scientific expertise as a legitimation for intervention, the difficulty figures have in admitting to mistakes and the shortcomings of knowledge. The longer the pandemic went on, the more humility was needed in terms of public health officials in saying, no, we did not foresee this. Oh, we didn't realize that vaccines would not, in fact, solve everything and end everything. And I think a lot of cynicism within at least BC came from that initial believing that it's science-based, and then when things obviously could not be upheld with scientific knowledge, there was no acknowledgement. And so I think the absence of humility in public discourse, and that's true not just for scientists, but it's more broadly, I think that's something to think about in terms of also in the context of populism and a lack of trust in experts or elected officials. That's the first thing. And you mentioned the kind of tension between elected officials and experts, but I also want to put in elected experts and capitalism and that tension that we really saw playing out. And in BC, was quite moderate. Restaurants stayed open throughout the pandemic, but there really was a sense after a while that it was justified as it was safe for public health reasons, but really it was, vested interests, business lobbies that really worked very hard to remain open. And again, no discussion, no acknowledgement of that. So again, I think that expertise, however much we value it, can also be used to shut down discussions when there really need to be discussion.
Professor Lightfoot.
Thanks for all of those thoughts. And again, I want to take an Indigenous politics perspective on the pandemic. And certainly, as in most cases, how we operated as institutions and as policy during the pandemic revealed a whole lot and amplified a whole lot of our weak spots that we were aware of, but then became quite central in our vision as we moved through the pandemic. There were, and no exceptions from the Indigenous space, the pandemic revealed inherent weaknesses in the relationship and certainly deepened the trust deficit between First Nations communities and government, whether they be provincial or federal. And there were a few key points that were very contentious, especially in British Columbia, about data sharing on public health. And very early on in the pandemic, there was a policy that stated that when we were keeping track of individual cases and doing the contact tracing, there was a 5 to 10 day delay in getting the information about a positive case to First Nations governments. So they were left in an extremely vulnerable position, often because communities are tight-knit, people are living in close quarters, sometimes often in less than perfect conditions. So 5 to 10 days is enough for a single case to ravage a community, and that was happening. And it was all because data wasn't shared due to privacy concerns. So there was some strong advocacy by the later stages of the pandemic by First Nations communities to get faster access to data so that they could take matters into their own hands and put their own lockdowns and curfews and contact tracing and social distancing in place. And then what we also saw at first, but then as the pandemic went on into that first summer, was a strong assertion of self-determination by Indigenous communities who decided to take matters again into their own hands. And what we saw in a lot of cases in the early days was checkpoints and roadblocks put up at the entrance to reserves so that they could monitor who was coming in and who was going out and take care of that governance, that public health governance themselves. And as it moved forward, BC opened up at a much faster rate than most First Nations communities. They opened up when they felt comfortable and not before. And there was quite a bit of tension between the provincial authorities and First Nations communities. But out of that came a much stronger assertion, understanding, and some new communication pathways. Again, it's a positive backhanded benefit of the pandemic, but we'll watch how long it stays.
Professor Thompson? Good. Pass? Okay, let's move on to our third question. Recent Canadian constitutional history could, on the one hand, be characterized by the failure of reform attempts, growing concerns about centralization, and its limited ability to recognize Indigenous sovereignties. On the other hand, it could be characterized by its robust defense of individual and minority rights, which has provided protections against the majoritarian excesses of legislatures. How would you characterize what the Constitution contributes to Canadian democracies? Do democratic practices exist in Canada in spite of or because of the Constitution? Professor Beland, would you like to begin?
The answer is both. But of course, I will say more than that.
Typical political scientist.
Yes. So I would say both and then run away and let you imagine the answer. But now, more seriously, obviously, we are a parliamentary democracy, and our constitution has democratic principles within it, but there are tensions. For example, we have an unelected Senate, which is part of our constitutional framework. The fact that it's unelected obviously is a challenge to the democratic principle, at least how it's understood in other parts of the world and by political theorists. So there is a challenge here. So there are tensions like this within our constitution. And another challenge, of course, we are in Quebec, so I have to talk about the Charter and the notwithstanding clause, something that actually John has written about quite extensively on the CBC website. Very good articles, by the way. This is a major issue. So there is an article published a while back by Peter Russell, of course, well-known Canadian political scientist, and the title of the piece is that the notwithstanding clause is the Charter's homage to parliamentary democracy. So there is a sense that the notwithstanding clause, of course, is about the democratic principle. That is that, facing, say, a negative court decision that the federal government or a province could use for 5 years the notwithstanding clause to shield a piece of legislation from challenges under the Charter for specific provisions, sections of the Charter, not the entire Charter. So it's perceived as an expression of the democratic principle. But there is a tension here between, obviously, the existence of the notwithstanding clause, which was inserted into the constitutional agreement in 1981 at the request of some provincial leaders to defend this principle of parliamentary democracy, and then the protection of minority rights. And it's something that we see in Quebec in the case of Bill 21 on secularism that was adopted a few years ago, and more recently, earlier this year, Bill 96 on protection of French language. And so what we see here is the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. Not after, say, a negative court decision that forces you to, protect the legislation you care about, but you basically write that in preemptively. And I think that this raises a lot of issues. And of course, there is an ongoing debate in Quebec and beyond Quebec about this use of the notwithstanding clause. At the same time, I want to go back to my discussion about the Constitution more generally. This use of the notwithstanding clause in Quebec is not new. The preemptive use is new under Legault. But, from 1982 to 1985, under the PQ government, they attached the notwithstanding clause to all the bills that were adopted in the National Assembly to protest against the fact that Quebec didn't sign the 1981 constitutional agreement leading to patriation. So the use of the notwithstanding clause in Quebec, it has been quite common in our history if you compare to all the other provinces, in part, I think, because there's this deficit of legitimacy of the Charter because Quebec didn't sign the agreement, even if, of course, the Charter applies to Quebec. At the same time, I want to say that people who use this argument to justify the use of the notwithstanding clause, saying what Quebec didn't sign, it was imposed on Quebec in a way, the Charter, both in terms of Bill 21, for example, it's not just about using the notwithstanding clause, it's also revising Quebec's own Charter. A charter that was adopted by the National Assembly years before the federal charter. So, and that affects minority rights in the province. And people who oppose, say, Bill 21, they don't just necessarily refer to the federal charter, but also to the changes that were made to the provincial charter of rights and freedoms that we have here. It's called actually the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. That was adopted in the mid-1970s. So I think that this is a concern, and there is a balance here between this democratic principle, the majority will, if you want, as expressed by parliamentarians in the House of Commons, or in that case in the National Assembly here in Quebec, and individual rights, especially minority rights. And I think that's It's not only happening in Quebec, I think, but these two cases, Bill 21 and Bill 96, I think will be studied for many years to come, especially the court decisions that are still forthcoming about these two pieces of legislation.
Thank you so much, Professor Beland. Would any of the panelists like to take those reflections further?
I mean, I don't have a good answer, but I've been thinking a lot about norms. And Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea with when the notwithstanding clause was put into the Constitution was that it would be invoked rarely. Yes. Right? It would be invoked rarely. And its invocation is democratic because it's part of the Constitution, or democratic Constitution. But the idea that it would be invoked rarely is a norm, right? Right? Or a convention. And I think that if there's one lesson that we can take from the disaster of the Trump presidency is that we should be very worried about any deeply held principles which are in fact just norms, because they are easily broken with very little consequence other than what? Shame? That's not a very good concept. It doesn't work. Blame, scrutiny, maybe some consternation. So, as we engage with this populism, the oncoming threat of populism, and as we perhaps look to what has already happened in the United States, I think that it's worth thinking about how much of our politics is in fact propped up by conventions that can in fact be quite easily broken.
Please.
Thanks for that. It is shocking in the current world how little shame moves matters. And I think that's not just true in populist movements in North America. We're seeing that worldwide, that some of the most reticent partners or players on the world stage are impervious to shame. They doesn't bother them a bit. Okay. Constitutional questions. Thank you. Section 35 was a huge victory in 1982, and it was hard fought. It was never intended to be complete at that point. There were many, many, many questions left unanswered. It's been called an empty box of rights that needs filling. Since then, we've had quite a few different moves. Internationally, we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which does not align with Section 35 and the court's understanding of it. So there are many more conversations yet to come, and I, for one, would welcome a renewal of that conversation. There were discussions, several points along the way that failed, and so I think eventually we'll come back to that. And I just want to note, on the side note, the other country that's really grappling this where Indigenous rights are concerned is New Zealand, and they are also actively putting forward some constitutional questions. I'll actually be there in November for a constitutional meeting that's looking at how, well, New Zealand has no written constitution, so if there were to be one, what space would there be for Indigenous rights in the UN Declaration there? So not small questions by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm also going to put in another plug for some moves that New Zealand made when you talk about electoral reform. So New Zealand moved to the MMP system in the mid-1990s. And at first, the changes were incremental. But what has happened in the decades since then, and where we are at currently today, is the party that holds the balance of power in New Zealand is now the Maori Party. Because no one can form government without them. And so even though there are only 3, 4, 5 seats, maybe 6 seats in any given election, they hold the balance of power. That would never have happened without electoral reform. And so it's these kind of incremental changes that lead us to working out solutions on the larger high-level constitutional questions. So thanks for tabling that. Appreciate it.
On issue of constitutionalism and indigenous politics, I'm thinking about the discussion for the incorporation of the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People in Canadian law. And I think that, is this better? Okay, because there was some feedback. Like Danielle, you said, in answering the question, you said yes and no. And I think that's both, yes. Both, I agree. Okay, both. It both enables and it can be a danger for democracy. So when we look at a complex, plural democracy with indigenous peoples and various distinct political groups governing themselves, a constitution where UNDRIP would be incorporated could create an constitutional space to articulate political discourses and rights, and it could be a powerful rhetorical tool in order to assert and claim rights over land, for instance, and representation. But one issue with constitutional integration of UNDRIP in Canada, for instance, is that that indigenous self-determination is sui generis, right? It's of its own kind. It's grounded in indigenous people, own peoplehood, own initial instruction, own stories. They're distinct peoplehood. And one of the risks is that by incorporating UNDRIP and giving it a constitutional form, we might end up confusing the legal form of the recognition for what it's actually trying to capture, the underlying indigenous self-determination, which is always prior and first. So we shouldn't extinguish that political difference through the acknowledgement of UNDRIP in the Constitution.
Yeah, I just want to echo I think for me, a key impetus for constitutional reform is to move forward on the question of indigenous self-determination and how is this, which seems to be nearly impossible under the current constitutional order. On the one hand, there is a recognition of treaties, there is UNDRIP, but still, the Canadian state is sovereign. And when you look at various court judgments, that's what it comes down to in the end. And figuring out, can there be a meaningful reform that really allows for that space that is necessary for true self-determination? I don't think that's possible right now. And I think that would be a really important reason to think, what can we change?
Fascinating stuff. I'm suppressing my own desire to ask other questions right now, but let's move on. There is a tendency in Canada to examine our politics through an American lens, and we often find comfort in the comparison. I think this is particularly acute when it comes to racism and other forms of systemic discrimination. Whatever our problems, we're not as bad as the US, or at least that's a sentiment I think is widely shared. What effect does this have, though, on the study of race in Canada? Does racism look different in Canada than it does in the US? And if so, why? Professor Thompson, would you like to begin?
Yeah, that's clearly a me question, huh? I feel like I've told everyone in this room this spiel before, because I know all of you, because Canada's tiny. We know very clearly it makes sense to think about the ways that racism's baked into every social, legal, political, economic institution in the US. I think that's quite clear. And that's a much harder sell in Canada. And it's a much harder sell for a couple of reasons. I think our political culture has quite a bit to do with it. We Canadians have incredible trust in institutions. There's quite a bit of anti-American sentiment baked into our political culture, I would argue. We have a history which is quite different than the US, obviously. Our dominant cleavages are different, the demographics are different, and our institutions are different, right? And of course, there's quite a distinct approach to the Crown Indigenous relations in Canada as compared to what happened in the US. But there's generally like a tendency, I think, to argue kind of one of two things. One thing that I hear a lot is that racism doesn't exist here. I hear that a lot. The other thing I hear is that racism here is exactly the same as it is in the US, and neither of those things are correct. Neither of those interpretations are correct. Obviously, there are significant and persistent racial disparities in nearly every socioeconomic indicator in this country. And the idea that racism doesn't exist in Canada is absolutely ludicrous. So we can just like put that to the side right now. But the idea that systemic and structural racism would operate in Canada in the same way as it operates in the US also doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. There are different political histories and institutions, and these things matter quite a bit. And so I think a better question to ask, and the question that I've been asking for a while now and will continue to ask, is what is it specifically about the Canadian political system that enables the racial inequalities and disparities that we see, right? What are the institutional arrangements that precede, precondition, and enable these racially disparate outcomes, and how do these effects cascade through law and policy? Like that's a better empirical and theoretical question, I think. And so, of course, I've been doing this work for a while, and just to give a really quick example of an answer that Keith Banting and hi Keith, came up with in CJPS last year, was to think through like why it is that Canadian policies don't in fact address racial inequality directly, and why is it that racial economic inequality hasn't emerged as a central feature of policy debates in this country. And we make a few arguments, but one of the arguments we make is the way that universalist norms are deeply embedded in the policy architecture that we inherited from the post-war era. And those norms tend to render racism as either antithetical or incidental to the operation of Canadian liberalism. So we make this argument around what we call policy inertia, which is slightly different than policy drift, right? It's the way that institutionalized ideas frame problems in ways that better reflect the past and the present. But I think that the point I'm trying to make here is that, if you look to the US and you look to like, why is it that we see, racial segregation in major American cities? Like redlining, right? Zoning covenants, like housing associations. Like you can point to very particular mechanisms, and those mechanisms operate differently here. And my hunch is that it's actually something like policy inertia. And there's something around policy inertia, policy drift. My hunch is that discretion actually has played an incredible role in enabling the agents of the state to discriminate freely, even when explicit policies were not on the books. That's kind of what happened in a lot of Canadian immigration policy, if you look back through our history. And I think that really getting at like those histories and digging deep and finding the empirical evidence is our next task. And the good news is there's just a ton of work to be done. Grad students, we need you to do work on race. We don't know so much. And there is, of course, incredible work coming out of the U.S. on things like the eviction crisis. My former colleague Chloe Thurston just wrote a fabulous book on the relationship between race and debt, like race and the wealth gap, the criminal punishment system, and the carceral state. Vesla Weaver's work on race-class subjugated communities, the combination of immigration and the criminal punishment system, which is called crimmigration. Like anything in urban politics, there's just so much we actually don't know here, and we need to start doing this work like yesterday.
Who wants to riff off that?
That means I win.
I just want to say that, it's important for even people who don't necessarily work on race and ethnicity, that they should pay attention to these factors. So that's a message for political scientists here. We have a lot of PhD students, MA students, I know them, that it's not, you don't have to be a specialist. It's the same thing for gender, by the way, and other factors, that you don't have to be a specialist of gender or race to take into account these factors in your own empirical research. So that's just my message, that it has to sink in, that because for a long time, and that's the case in other countries, not just in Canada, but it's just that you have specialists of something, and then it's like they work on this. But I think it's all of us should take that into account and take that seriously. The same thing for indigenous politics. This is not just indigenous politics. This is Canadian politics. The same thing when we talk about racism. It's not just about visible minorities or racialized minorities. It's about our country, or it's about our province, about our city. And I think as political scientists and as social scientists, we have to take these factors seriously in our research, even if it's not focused necessarily on that issue per se. That's my message.
Thanks. I think that the idea that, like you said, that there's no racism in Canada is completely ludicrous. But the comparison that is often made with the US, I think, points to a form of what we call sometimes in indigenous studies, various indigenous scholars call moves to innocence, where we exonerate ourselves from any implication in wrongdoing. And it's kind of a failure to recognize issues that need to be changed. And we've seen it in various ways in public discourse in Quebec. For instance, the premier denied for the existence of systemic racism. And if you can't recognize what is wrong, you can't change it. Right? Business goes on as usual once again, because the issue is an issue between individuals. We have racist individuals. We don't have a racist system, so we don't need to change anything. We just have to remove the rotten apples and everything will go smoothly after that. I think that's entirely wrong. That simply serves to consolidate the status quo, to refuse change once again. And in a settler colonial context like that of Canada, it's a failure to appreciate the deep embedded ways in which our institutions connect with systemic dynamics of exploitation, dispossession, displacement, and enslavement. This needs to be recognized in order to be corrected.
Just to add on to what you said, Debra, I think discretion is really important, especially for me studying immigration and bureaucratic decision making. That's a very powerful mechanism of exclusion. But I think we need to also take seriously the intersection of race and class, especially in Canada. And again, looking at immigration and the way the system is set up, we all know high-skilled immigration is favored under the system. But even, looking at who's able to get a visitor visa to come to Canada, well, the one region where it is by far the hardest, nearly impossible, is sub-Saharan African countries. And it's justified in class economic terms, likelihood to return. But I think you can easily argue that's a pretty thinly veiled racism as an undercurrent in that who's desirable, who do we want, who don't we want. So I think class is one way in which race gets whitewashed in Canada.
Just mindful of time here. Let's move on. Let's talk about social movements. Land Back, Black Lives Matter, the Freedom Convoy, all indicate there is dissatisfaction with using the formal political process to be heard or to initiate political change. Are these criticisms accurate? How are social actors challenging the imaginary of Canadian democracy? Professor Lightfoot, would you like to begin?
Thanks very much for that question. And again, I'm going to harken back to what I said in my opening comments. Certainly for Indigenous people in this place we now call Canada, democracy has not by and large been a positive experience. It's been imposed. There's been both covert and overt efforts to assimilate into a very European colonial system, which is at heart based in the assumptions of white supremacy. We often don't talk about the underlying assumption, which is a racist assumption at heart, that European institutions, systems, structures are superior to all others and that they have nothing to take or learn from others. That kind of exclusion creates tensions is only the beginning. It creates such a feeling of exclusion and impossibility of being part of conversations or decision making that when repeated, you will eventually see it explode in particular social movements. And I think that truth follows Black Lives Matter and the Freedom Convoy, although my politics are quite different. I think the principles are the same. There's an atmosphere of feeling that the decision making is being done in an autocratic, not a democratic or inclusionary way. And I think, and I can't believe Idle No More is 10 years old already. Certainly, I'm not 10 years older, but it is 10 years old. It happened in the fall and winter months of 2012, 2013. So that's already a decade ago. Black Lives Matter is newer, and the Freedom Convoy is the most recent iteration. All of these were also made possible by very democratizing technological development, which is social media. So movements are finding closed doors and constraints and lack of opportunity to participate within the democratic formal institutions. They're taking matters into their own hands and broadcasting themselves on various forms of social media. So I think that's a trend that will necessarily change institutional structures, norms, and institutions in ways we may or may not be quite ready for. Because, like I say, Freedom Convoy is not my particular kind of politics, but it's replicating the same strategies and tactics and norms of other social movements. And we are all going to have to contend with this, because the more doors are closed, they will find openings in other areas. So I think in the interest of time, I'll just stop there and invite others to jump in.
Just add on one thing to what Sheryl just said, and that is that I think our democracy has not found a way to meaningfully engage with these movements, right? We've got the police, we've got emergency powers, but that is not a constructive intervention. And the question is, how can we take these concerns and have a conversation that allows, it allows for listening, at least.
Yeah, I just want to add that, the study of social movements, especially in sociology, has been dominated by, the study of progressive social movements, of left-wing movements. And you look at the French tradition with Alain Touraine, in North America with Charles Tilly and his colleagues, study of contentious politics. There is a focus on, more progressive left-leaning groups. I think it's time to spend more time studying, they are not often called social movements, but they are social movements like the Freedom Convoy, and right-wing and even far-right grassroots movements. And to study them and compare them with, the traditional social movements that we study, which tend to be left-leaning in terms of their strategies, their repertoires of contention, to use a concept by Tilly, their mobilization tactics, and so forth. And I think we need to study these groups much more systematically than we have done, even if we don't like their politics, because many of us political scientists don't like their politics. It's important to study them, because if we don't study them, it might be harder later on to address them as a threat to democracy, perhaps.
So in engaging with indigenous resistance, at least, I think we shouldn't immediately group them under the umbrella protest, for instance, or challenging policies of the state, right? And I'm thinking here of water protectors and the people who were opposing the pipeline in the North Dakota Access Pipeline, NODAPA, who were saying, we are not protesting, we're protecting. Right? Don't read our action as one of protest and directed towards the state. Our action is one directed to our relative, the Missouri River. Our actions are our responsibilities. Similarly, John Burroughs, talking about indigenous blockades, asks the question, who blockades who? Right? Sometimes it's the crown who's blockading indigenous people, not indigenous people blockading access to the territories of the crown. I think indigenous resistance can be a very deep challenge to institutions of democracy as they've been understood, because they enact an alternative, a different political world. Leanne Simpson talks about generative refusal, where the refusal of the settler state is also generative of an indigenous lifeway. Glenn Coulthard talks of prefigurative practices, where the resistance enacts a different envisioned world. I think that there are some indigenous movements that are indeed arising from form of dissatisfactions, but other indigenous movements should not be read as that. They should be read more deeply as these forms of disjunctures, or of enacting an alternative. And I think we, as theorists, as scientists, we do need to perceive that very well if we are to understand the political conduct that is taking place.
Yeah, really quickly. I think there are layers of democratic action going on. I think that we would like to, at a level of principle, we'd like to think that when we see social movements, that they are the embodiment of democratic action, right? The right to protest is a fundamental democratic right. And yet, when things become inconvenient, we call the cops to remove protesters. And sometimes we don't even need to call the cops or remove protesters, because if they are Black or Indigenous, the cops are already there. So, and so on the one hand, we see protest as the embodiment of democracy. On the other hand, we don't want too much democracy, because that's very inconvenient for our lives. And if we had a third hand, I don't know. Let me end there before I get myself in trouble. What I wanted to say was that, like, we have to not also social movements. Protest is part of democracy, but the way in which social movements themselves govern themselves may not be democratic at all. So be aware of the kinds of assumptions we make about the relationship between social movements and democracy.
Last question for our panel, at least that I have. A related question, but I think might allow us to riff off what we've been talking about. Populism can, of course, take many forms. In recent years, though, populist movements in Canada have embraced many of the tenets of the far right, expressing everything from anti-immigrant to anti-vaccine sentiment. What are the sources of these more recent populist movements? How serious a threat is populism to Canadian democracy? Professor Ellermann, why don't you begin?
Sure. So I want to start, I have two examples. One is an example that really is a far-right example, in my view. The People's Party of Canada was mentioned earlier. It's for those among us who are more familiar with the US context and European context, that will be more recognizable as a far-right party, not just economically libertarian, but also very much culturally nationalist and anti-immigration, anti all sorts of diversity. And that's a small party in Canada, 4.9% of the vote in 2021, no seats because of the electoral system. So it's there, but it's very small. It's not a significant party at this point. And so what I think is worth spending more, and the reasons for, voting, the 4.9% voting, I think in terms of literature, people would point to the explanations that have been given for the rise of far-right populism in Europe. Big structural changes in the economy in terms of wage stagnation, inequality, and also social changes in the 70s in terms of increasing religious, ethnic diversity, more gender equality, same-sex marriage, and so on. So these factors, I would imagine, are carrying the same way into Canada. But the kind of new what I would call a right libertarian populism that we see under Poilievre, and we may see with the next government, depending on how successful the Conservatives are. I think it's worth thinking more about, because there is obviously there's more excitement about that among segments of the Conservative Party, at least. And what is really interesting there is that we have classic conservative economic agenda, especially, in the context of the pandemic, got to lower the deficit, lower taxes, lower spending. But then there is this big libertarian agenda that is very much has a popular tinge, sometimes very strongly popular, where regulations are to blame for lack of economic growth. Therefore, let's fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, the clear populist twist to that, which we don't otherwise hear very often in Canadian politics. Vaccine mandates, masking, there's no way we would reinstate them because they really don't allow us to be who we are, to be self-determining as individuals. The kind of making Canada the greatest nation on earth rhetoric, which is a very populist rhetoric, but it's typically the way it's used, it's in a really libertarian sense, an attack on all sorts of institutions, including, as you know, the CBC, call for defunding the CBC. So it's a very policy-rich agenda in terms of what could happen under that. But I think from my perspective, what I think is really interesting in, again, thinking about what is distinct about Canada and this particular populism is that it's missing that cultural nationalism that is really defining of most, if not all, other far-right populist parties. Poilievre is in favor of high levels of immigration. He's not gonna, he's not speaking out against reproductive rights, against rights for gender and sexual minorities. All of these things would be at the forefront of platforms in far-right populist parties in Europe and also among Republicans. And so to think about what is so different about Canada, I think there's a political cultural element, though I'm always careful to make any statements about culture, because I think things can change much faster than we believe they can change. But there's still much more centrism in Canada when you look at the ideological orientation of voters than in the US. We've got about 66% of Canadians are in the center compared to 40% of Americans. All of the four big parties have to appeal to the center if they want to stand a chance of getting votes, or significant amounts of votes. And then what is really important on immigration, and the fact that immigration is not at the heart of this populism, at least as it manifests in the party arena, is that it's impossible for a party to win the election while alienating immigrant voters, ethnic minority voters, the nature of the first past the post electoral system, the fact of high levels of immigration, the fact that Canada has the highest naturalization rate in the world, and the fact that these voters are living around the urban cores, especially in Toronto and in Vancouver. These are the ridings, the districts that really matter to win the election. So for purely strategic reasons, even if we do not care about and don't believe in differences in political culture, for purely strategic reasons, institutional reasons, I could go on the fact that rural conservative constituencies are not represented in the same way as they're in the US. There is no Senate. There are many institutional differences that produce important differences in terms of the representation of cultural conservatism. Not to say that Canadians can't think that way, but I think institutions are really important to think about.
Yes, thank you. I think populism in Canada, there is when we talk about the federal level, so we talk about the recent conservative leadership race and so forth, but I think we have to pay attention to populism at the sub-national level. So what's happening in the provinces or regional forms of populism in Alberta. Now in Quebec, it's hard sometimes to draw a line between populism and sub-state nationalism, right? But in Quebec, the debate on immigration is very central to the campaign that we are having now, the provincial campaign. So I think that what you're saying is absolutely true about populism at the federal level. But I think when you deal with the provinces, it's different. Also, the problem with populism at the federal level is what is the people in Canada? It's so diverse in terms there is immigration, indigenous peoples, but also Quebec, the French-English thing, dichotomy, and so forth. So it's hard to project a coherent people at the federal level. But in Quebec, you can do that provincially with the Francophone majority in Quebec. In Alberta, you have this populism there too on the prairie, which exists at the subnational regional level. It's the people of that region of the country who mobilize against the federal government. So often there is this relationship. The elite that they criticize is the federal elite. And you see that with the race in Alberta with the United Conservative Party right now. And what Danielle Smith is proposing, talking a bit about Alberta, I love Alberta politics. I lived in Alberta for 6 years. It's very interesting. So it's also strange sometimes, but Quebec politics is strange too, right? So in its own way. But the Sovereignty Act, what Danielle Smith is proposing, it's grounded in populism, but populism directed against the federal government. And we see that certainly in Quebec as well with the CAQ government. But again, in Quebec, it's hard to disentangle populism and sub-state nationalism. And so it's a question of terminology. It's a bit tricky, but I think that we should draw a line between populism in federal politics and populism at the provincial level, especially in places like Alberta and Quebec, although they are very different provinces, but there are some similarities in the sense that if you want to succeed in Quebec politics, you have to criticize the federal government, and it's the case in Alberta, at least if you're on the right of the political spectrum.
We give the last word to... We still have a bit of time left, so if there are any questions from the audience, just raise your hand or come forward or shout it really loudly.
One thing that I find very interesting is we have played a little bit at the beginning with the definition of is Canada in fact a democracy? In certain respect, it isn't. But also on a certain plane, can you okay? But Canada is also a monarchy, and since we have talked, I have not heard anything about this, and I know that there's this sensibility in English Canada, and also maybe among the Francophone, that we should not talk too much about that distant reality because it feels like it is. But at the same time, with such issues that you have brought before, that we need a change, we feel it, but shouldn't we take that opportunity with change of monarch to question the place of the Francophone minorities in Canada and also the indigenous people and of the different people? Because I think, and also just a bunch of problems could be solved if we took that opportunity to envision a Canada that would be very, very different than what it is right now. Because I feel like that if Canada still rests is maybe not the exact word, but just stays in its actual convenient phase, it will face much harder crises eventually with populism and the climate crisis and many others.
Yes, it's a great question. And, I've been answering questions from journalists about the monarchy in Quebec. And it's true that here in Quebec, support for the monarchy is very low. It's below 20%. And among Francophones, it's even lower. The problem, of course, and across Canada, it's also the support for the monarchy is declining among Anglophones as well, especially younger people. The problem, and we go back to the Constitution, is that if you want to let's say you want to move beyond the monarchy, you will need support from all the 10 provinces and Parliament, right? So good luck with that. I mean, in the sense that politically, it's the bar is really high in terms of, it's the most stringent conditions that you have in terms of amending the Constitution. So I think even if there was a significant majority of Canadians who wanted to, say, move beyond a constitutional monarchy, I think constitutionally, it would be a very big challenge because of these institutions. And yes, political scientists have been written about this for decades, that institutions matter, they can be sticky, they can be self-reinforcing. And when you have the amending formula, this specific amending formula makes change really hard. I don't want to say it will never happen. It might happen, but I don't think it will happen anytime soon. Regardless of the change in public opinion, I think it will, if it happens, it might happen in my lifetime. I'm old, so maybe not. But I don't think it's something that will happen anytime soon if it happens. Because it's still a very controversial topic. It's true if it was just of Quebec, I think it will be quite clear. But attachment to the monarchy is still quite strong outside of Quebec. It varies from province to province, but there is a decline, especially among younger people. So we'll see what happens with King Charles III and what will happen in terms of support for the monarchy, because Elizabeth II was a very popular monarch around, in the UK and within the Commonwealth. But Charles starts with much lower favorability numbers in terms of popularity. And, there is also a movement, Barbados last year, in the name of, post-colonial change, exited the monarchy. They are talking about doing that in Jamaica. Australia, the Labour government has even appointed an assistant minister of the Republic, and they want to hold a referendum on the future of the monarchy if they are re-elected. So there is change within the Commonwealth, and there is opposition to the monarchy that's growing in many countries. But Canada, I think, if something big will happen like in Australia, then maybe there will be more discussion about this here. But because of the way the Constitution is written, Section, I think, 51 and the 1982 Constitution Act is just, the bar is really high. So you will need to convince that, all the 10 provincial legislatures and the Senate and the House of Commons will have to vote in favor of it for it to happen. So I think, again, I said earlier that our political class, they are traumatized by what happened with Meach and Charlottetown and the defeats of these constitutional agreements, their death. So, talking about, even if there was strong popular support to end monarchy, I think politically, I don't see, also there is no federal party that's supporting ending the monarchy. Like in Australia, there's the Labour Party, they are in power, they support that. The Conservatives, of course, support the monarchy, and the Liberals too. Justin Trudeau clearly supports keeping our ties with, the monarchy. So I don't think that this is something that will happen anytime soon. But at some point, we might talk more about it if, especially, so many countries in the Commonwealth exit the monarchy and become republics. Long answer, sorry.
So I think we have a Professor Allard-Tremblay who'd like to weigh in, and Professor Lightfoot as well.
Thanks. Be brief. One of my paper was once described as offering one of the most radical defense of the intervention of the Crown in the legislative process. So you might not be surprised if I speak in favor of the monarchy, but for a different reason. Indigenous people have a special relationship with the Crown, and that's a key expression. We spoke about "idle no more," and that expression came back, and it has a specific meaning. Some of the number treaties were made with the Crown, and the expectation was that Canada would become like a sibling under the Crown. But that's not what happened. What happened is that Canada, when it separated, became Canada, imposed its own superiority and primacy over Indigenous people. So rather than being like all the children of the Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Indigenous people, right, in a sibling relationship, it turned into one of subordination. So saying, let's get rid of the Crown, is once again sidelining this special relationship that Indigenous people have been saying, you forgot about that. We have this special relationship and we still have it. And so when Teresa Spence was protesting, not protesting, but was doing a hunger strike during Idle No More, she was requesting a meeting with the Governor General. And that's not without reason. It's because the relationship of Indigenous people is often not understood as being with Canada.
Thank you for taking my point. But I'm just going to expand on it a little bit because there is some diversity in that conversation. And I think a lot of that ties to geography. So the treated areas and pre-Confederation treaties are with the Crown. And in political spaces, the Crown is seen as the protector against the oppression by Canada, as Yann was saying. And so there is a different perspective on the monarchy in that respect. Now, I live in British Columbia, which is untreated, primarily unceded territory in any respect, where the Crown has just asserted sovereignty and holds underlying rights and title, so it says. And so my inbox right now is full with Indigenous students expressing their feelings about Monday being a holiday, and that the university has put out statements about the Queen and her legacy, and they're wondering, what about the violence that the Crown has committed against us? So I think British Columbia's perspective, quite different from the rest of Canada. The experience is different, the historical context is different, and so I'm seeing the array in front of me. But I can say, for people who have experienced the Crown as not a partner or not as a nation-to-nation understanding, but as an oppressor, this is a very painful time. So there's just a huge spectrum.
We only have 3 minutes left, so I'd like to turn the tables on our moderator. Because one of the things we haven't talked about is the relationship between media and democracy. And as a journalist, one of the central arguments in Ziblatt and Levitsky's How Democracies Die is that the media need to act as our guardrails protecting democracy. So given the state of affairs, how prepared do you feel that the Canadian media is to help protect against the threats to Canadian democracy? Mr. Montpetit.
Thanks for that, Deb. So I think one interesting development out of American media corporations, or just American journalism in general, is a move towards creating democracy reporters or democracy journalists. So in the sense that democracy is now a beat. There's another kind of discourse which is quite interesting in American journalism. And I think it came quite prominent following the January 6th assault on the Capitol, is for journalists to kind of break with their ostensible nonpartisan nature and to declare themselves pro-democracy. And so this is something you might see sometimes in Twitter bios of American journalists. We're pro-democracy. The Washington Post changed its slogan, democracy dies in darkness. So, like in one way, as a journalist, I find that quite interesting. I don't know if Canadian journalism is quite yet at the moment where we feel as existentially threatened as American journalists do. I think certainly as populism increases, as hostility towards the media increases, journalists are increasingly getting dragged into the story, which makes us deeply uncomfortable, much like Deb dragging me into this conversation makes me deeply uncomfortable. So I think we need a question. I think journalists need to be able to answer what it is that we do contribute to Canadian democracy. And I really loved some of your points, Professor Lightfoot, like about kind of also troubling the notion of Canadian democracy. So maybe I'll rephrase that. What is it that Canadian journalists and Canadian media contributes to democratic practices in Canada? Because I do think one of the things that we have to be open to is that many of the Canadian institutions are deeply problematic and engage in quite a bit of violence. And journalism in Canada has for a long time been complicit in that by not questioning those institutions. So it's a rambling answer to say I'm going to work on a more convincing answer, but I think that's a question for all journalists. Before anybody has a chance to argue with me, I'm going to end the plenary session. But before I do, please give our panelists a very warm applause. Merci beaucoup. Thank you all. I hope you guys have a great stay in Montreal and a great conference.